Doc Quake, Cowboy Joe with you. And, man, have we got a very, very special guest on the line with us. Joe just gave him a ring, and he has got 5 minutes for us, and we will tell you one of the legendary boxing analysts in sports history, Mr. Larry Merchant, on the line with us. Mr. Merchant, we really appreciate your time this afternoon. How you doing?
All right. Thank you for having me.
Well, of course, the passing of Muhammad Ali, and we've started our show with tributes and callers, and the calls have just been pouring in. And just talk about, in your estimation, what he meant to not only sports but the world, really.
Well, Ali was a one-of-a-kind American original, a great athlete, heavyweight champion, kind of one-man Cirque du Soleil.
Yeah, good way to put it.
A social activist at a time when the times were changing and people were in the streets and challenging all authority in our government over the war in Vietnam, for women's rights, for civil rights, and an ambassador for America when it ended, when it all was said and done.
Larry, do you remember when you first encountered Ali live?
Actually, I don't. I covered his big fights. I didn't cover his early fights. I saw them on television, his early professional fights, that is. What I remember is that he was big and fast and graceful and beautiful, and no one had ever seen a heavyweight like him, and there were a lot of skeptics on whether he was more of a showman than a fighter. And ultimately, we saw that he was not just a great boxer, but a great fighter with a great heart and a fierce will.
And I remember the 60 fight or the 62 fight, whatever it was, against Liston, and he certainly honed his skills after that. Don't you think, Larry? He became a much, much better fighter, boxer than he was when he
was a young guy, and it was natural for him to improve. He was being challenged by a lot of good, big, strong heavyweights with different styles over time, and his style changed over time. And so, it's fair to say those things, and he finally got the recognition that was due him, and he earned it. He earned it in the ring. But beyond that, he was such a controversial figure, changing his name and his religion, and becoming a conscientious objector to the war, and using the ring and his megaphone as to shout out to the world his take on what was going on in the tumultuous world at that time, and became a hero to, more than 1 billion Muslims, became a hero to everyone in Africa, and ultimately won over everybody in America.
I can't imagine what it'd be like being Muhammad Ali in that era, because you did have the war issues going on. You had race relations going on in the United States, and then he comes out and he just tells you like it is, or tells you his thoughts, and say, I don't care what you think.
And it wasn't a popular
opinion.
This is
what I'm saying. Yeah.
No, it was just the way he looked at life.
Well, and it wasn't just saying it; he lived it.
Right.
Yeah.
How many people do you know in any occupation who give up 3 of their prime years, which he did, by becoming a conscientious objector and being barred from the ring? That was not just saying it; it was living it.
It seemed to me that the brash and his ability to talk was spectacular, but so was the fact that every time he made a promise, he backed it up. He did. You look at the high-level athletes nowadays. that's impossible to do it every single time, and it seemed like Ali just rose to the occasion.
Well, he raised the stakes, by creating a narrative about every fight, by caricaturing his opponents, by having fun with it, being a Pied Piper, I felt I was, a ringside observer of the greatest show on earth every time he was performing. And if it wasn't whether he was going to win, it was when he was going to win, and rhyming about I'll get more and for and so on. And so he made it bigger than normally it could be, even if it was really big for a heavyweight championship. And that was his special genius.
Did Larry Merchant have a favorite Ali bout? Number one, in your opinion?
Well, I think first the first fight with Frazier is the greatest event I ever covered, because it was two undefeated heavyweight champions, Ali having been in exile for more than 3 years and having fought twice in the last previous 6 months or 9 months. And it was like America and the world was choosing sides. Joe came to represent the establishment, rightly or wrongly, fair or not fair, and Ali was the anti-establishment figure, and everybody had a stake in it. People wanted to see Ali's big mouth shut, but ultimately, even though he lost that fight, that I believe was the turning point where people came to start to appreciate, respect him, and eventually love him by the way he dealt with the defeat, by how gracious he was about the defeat. And the people who wanted to see his mouth shut suddenly realized they really didn't want to see his mouth shut.
I know it was a long time ago, and I'm trying to remember it. Larry, was Frazier ahead on the cards when he knocked him out with that left hook in that first bout?
He was. It was a close fight. I was one of the few fighters, ringsiders, who scored it for Ali, but Joe won the fight. Joe was a favorite of mine. He was an absolutely terrific fighter. In fact, I, as a Philadelphia sports editor and columnist, after Joe won the 1964 Olympic gold, he couldn't quit his job working in a slaughterhouse because he had a family to support, and the community got together and they formed a corporation called Cloverleigh and sold 80 shares for $250 a share. And this was kind of modeled about Ali when 11 Louisvillians got together and underwrote his career or his transformation into a professional. And I bought a share. And I bought a share as a stunt for $250 so I could write about Joe Frazier is my fighter.
That's awesome.
Wow.
And just had the most fun. And then about a year later, I went to New York as a columnist, and I sold the share for $2,000. And 2 years after that, Joe always reminded me the share was worth $14,000.
Larry, I'd like to buy.
I love Joe. I loved Ali. It was the greatest event I ever covered, and I covered a lot of big events in every sport. And then, of course, the Liston fights and all of that. So, yeah, I didn't know it at the time, or maybe I sensed it, but certainly not to the level it's gotten to that I was being a witness to some important social history.
Larry, before you get out of here, I'd like to say I'd like to buy a share of you beating Mayweather's ass. I would love to see that.
I was going to say that. Larry, I have a list of my favorite people, and it's on a Post-it note. That's how short it is, okay?
You can get a share of me for about 10 cents. It might be worth 5 cents in a year.
One of my favorite moments ever in boxing, Larry, is when you told Mayweather that. I watch it every day on YouTube.
It's awesome.
Thank you very much.
Mr. Larry Merchant, of course, longtime HBO boxing commentator. We appreciate you spending time and giving us your thoughts on Muhammad Ali.
Thank you.
Thank you, sir.
Thank you.
There you go. How about that? 78 through 2012, he was HBO World Championship.
He was the man now.
He
was the man.